My guest today is the godfather of modern game mastering, and he's the author of not only the Alexandrian blog, but the award-winning and the best-selling So You Want to Be a Game Master. He's also a playwright, an actor, a game designer, and in our opinion, one of the big three of modern tabletop RPG culture. It is Justin Alexander. Hey, Justin. So
Oh,
cool to meet you. How are you doing?
very cool to meet you too. Thank you so much for those very kind words. You've thrown me completely off balance right from the get.
Like I
Thank
said,
you
I
very.
didn't write them, but I did mean them when I said them. Just wait till you hear who the other big three are. Maybe you won't be so,
Oh no.
you know, so proud. No, so we actually had an argument about that because I wanted to include Jeff Ashworth, who wrote the Game Master's book of, so, he's got the traps and the puzzles and
Mhm.
dungeons and everything. But I think not a lot of people know who he is. He doesn't have the same kind of recognition that the name Alexander does, for example, or your Colvilles or your Mercers or that sort of thing. So I was outvoted on that by one guy, by my brother. That's how our relationship works. So you have been a prominent voice in RPG design for years. Before we started rolling, I said I started reading your blog almost 20 years ago. And in fact, is this the 20th year anniversary?
It is the 20th anniversary. I started the Alexandrian on July 4th, 2005. Uh,
Wow, just over 20
just
years.
over 20 years now. Yeah.
So you've been one of those lighthouses, at least online, for a really long time. How did you first get into it, though, into tabletop gaming and game mastering?
Well, I first got into role playing games back in 1989, and the path was rocky. The truth is, like, I knew about role-playing games because I'd seen the movie E.T. with some kids playing it. There were some ads in comic books that I'd seen for Dungeons& and Dragons. So I was kind of aware of this concept of role-playing games. People got together and told stories together and kind of lived in these imaginary worlds. I was like, "This sounds really cool," but I didn't really know how to actually do it or where to find those games. Like, it was '89, the World Wide Web didn't exist yet, so I couldn't just Google how to play D&D. And my first experience kind of like seeing a role playing game was actually at a comic book convention where I was flipping through a box of back issues, and they had a copy of the 1989 Batman role playing game, which a company called Mayfair had produced as a tie-in for the Tim Burton Batman movie. And I was like, "Oh, a role playing game! This is the thing I've been looking for. This is great!" So I bought the Batman role playing game, took it home, read it cover to cover, and had absolutely no idea how to play a role playing game at the end of it. Like, there were all these mechanics, there was all this
Right.
stuff, but like I had no idea what do I actually do with this stuff. Um, so I was still confused. And so my first experience actually playing a role playing game, well, I've told this story a few times, but was actually sitting down with my brother and being like, okay, I don't know how to make that book work, so I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna figure this out by myself. And so I actually kind of made up a role playing game based on my vague understanding on seeing the kids in ET, and I think at that point I maybe read Scott McCloud's Zot, which had like a whole issue that was about people playing role playing games. So I said, I'm just gonna figure it out. So I came up with this set of mechanics, which was anytime Batman, who was played by my brother, did something, I would roll a d6 and he would roll a d6. And if I, as the GM, rolled higher than he did, then he would fail. And if he rolled higher than I did, then Batman would succeed. And we played a little bit, but that game actually ended infamously when Batman crashed the Batmobile driving to Gotham in response to the bat signal because he rolled lower than me on his drive test. Because obviously you check for
Yeah.
everything Batman did,
Every
including
single thing.
driving to
Yeah.
Gotham.
It's actually pretty sophisticated
Yeah,
as
and
a
I figured
system.
out I
Yeah.
figured out we're not something's not right. I'm not this is close, but I'm clearly not doing something right because this doesn't feel right. So we ended the game there. And then there was a whole bunch of steps that eventually led me through a bunch of other games and eventually to Frank Menser's uh red box basic set for D&D. And that gave me enough insight, enough of a step-by-step kind of like approach to here's how you make the dungeon, here's how you run the dungeon, here's how you create a character, that I was able to actually figure out how to do this thing. And then I was off and running. And so you talked about So You Want to Be a Game Master. That was very much a book I wrote because it was the book I wish I had in the summer of
Right.
'89 when I was trying to figure out how this role playing game thing actually worked.
You're the second person. Is this a common thing? I think it must have been Rob Hines who, fourth edition D&D and 13th Age for the listeners, who said almost exactly the same thing about the Batman role playing game specifically. trying to figure out how it worked, not really understanding at the end of it, and then just doing his own thing
That's wild.
and essentially homebrewing. Yeah, I don't know if like it was
I
a
didn't know
particular
about
time
rap.
and
That is
place.
wild.
Yeah, and if I remembered that wrong, then Tristan cut this. Thank you.
Something in the
Yes.
air there, though, right? I think a lot of people had very similar experiences, whether it was specifically with the Batman game or not, and that is trying to figure out how to run these games and how to play these games, because there's a lot of role-playing games that just kind of quietly assume that, "Oh, of course you know how to do this because I know how to do this because I've been doing it for so long." And I actually think, like, one of my pet theories, going off on a huge tangent here, but one of my pet theories is that
Great.
the secret sauce of Dungeons and Dragons way back in 1974 wasn't necessarily the mechanics or even necessarily the concept of role-playing characters, although those were important. The thing that made D&D work was the fact that it came with this dungeon scenario structure and told the DM, these are the things you need to do to make a dungeon. Here's how you run that dungeon. Because up until that point, what you had was a community in the Twin Cities and also Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, where people had played in other people's games, and there was kind of oral tradition and the sense of, oh, I'm gonna kind of do it like Dave Arneson does. And even Dave Arneson was like, I'm gonna try and do the thing that David Wesley was doing with his Braunstein campaign. And so I'm gonna try and do these things. But it really relied on the referee having sort of an ineffable ability, an undefined ability to understand a world and communicate that world to their players, but trying to impart what that meant or what that looked like to somebody, say, reading a game manual wasn't a clear process until Arneson and Gygax clearly explained how a dungeon works so you could get your foot in the door, you could dip your toe into it and actually start running. And then once you're running, then you can grow like a crystal in water. But you have to actually figure out how to get people to the table and doing the thing, in my experience.
That is a really interesting point. That it's sort of a conspiracy theory. Why? Yeah. Why D&D specifically? When I think about those games, when I think about AD&D, and you think about Tristan has a reprint that I borrowed extensively. It doesn't feel all that usable to me, but I have modern sensibilities of like
Mhm.
it's extremely spelled out. You know, this is a conversation between you and your friends. You're gonna take turns doing this. You're gonna like all the context that you need almost culturally, like a subcultural context, is just given to you, and if you had to pick that up via just like hanging out with the right guys in Wisconsin before, then I mean, it'd just be impossible. But
Well,
if
one of
D&D
the
is the one that communicates that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, people talk about like why has the last 10 years or so been such a huge boom in role playing games in D&D? Why have we seen this huge boom in the number of players and sales and the number of games, everything else? One of the reasons for that is actual playing, and like Critical Role is important, but just in general, it's not so much about those games being as successful at generating fans for themselves as they are, and not to take anything away from them. But the mere fact that you can go online and watch people doing this, you don't have to be invited into the inner circle. You don't have to be a member of the Masons playing role playing games in a back room with Cheetos and Mountain Dew. You can just go online and watch hours and hours of really fantastic game masters doing their thing and players doing their thing. And and so the oral tradition escapes out of just this person to person contact, and now you can go to YouTube and you can see it. And so if you think all the way back to me in 1989 or Rob Heinzu back then as well, trying to figure out, okay, I've got a vague sense. I've seen ET, I've seen these other things. How does this work? Well, today you can just go to YouTube and watch Matthew Mercer or Brennan Lee Mulligan or Abria Iyengar or any of these other amazing GMs do their thing. And even if you don't necessarily know exactly how they're doing it, you at least go, oh, this is what we're doing.
That's what it looks like.
Yeah,
Yeah. And I can do that with my friends. I don't even need to be invited. I can just text my friend and say, hey, you seen this show? Let's do
100%.
this.
Well, and if you're
Yeah.
talking to somebody like, I don't get it, like, well, just go watch this and you'll understand.
Right. Look at this.
That actually reminds me of a
Yeah.
funny story where this is 15 years ago. I was getting married and we were doing my bachelor party, and my brother, who was my best man, asked me, "What do you want to do for this bachelor party?" I said, I really just want to take it kind of easy. We've been super busy. It's actually a summer of this is a tangent, but there was a summer of weddings where he got married, I got married, and one of our best friends all got married 3 weeks in a row. So it was a
Wow. I didn't
crazy,
consider it.
crazy summer. So I was like, I just want to take it easy. I don't want to go out. I just need a day where I'm not going crazy. It's like, okay. So he invited us all over to his house, and he decided to run 1974 D&D, so I could actually play as opposed to being a forever GM, and that was fantastic. But it was the whole wedding party, of course, who was coming over to play, and so one of my friends who was in the wedding party but had never played a role playing game before showed up and was like, "What are we doing?" And then we rolled up characters and we started playing. And about 5 minutes into it, he was like, "This is what this is? This is what we're doing?" And
Right.
like,
You
you could
just
see
don't
the light
know.
bulb. You could see the
Uh-huh.
light bulb going off of like, "Oh, I get it now." And like some people who have that moment will become absolutely enthralled with role playing games and play the rest of their lives. Other people who just like, that was a fun experience, but I get it now. And so there is that like, I get it, that I think is actually one of the most essential things for getting people into the hobby and playing these weird little games that we play.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's a very scary thing from the outside. Or you think it's like especially given the kind of cultural baggage it has, maybe not anymore, but 10 years ago, certainly,
Mhm.
like it's something that only the real scum nerds do. And so it couldn't possibly be something that me and my cool friends do,
Right. I mean, the
as much
exposure of
fun
geek
as it
culture
is.
helps too, but yeah, like it was like the Illuminati for geeks, right? There was this weird thing that happened in a back room someplace,
Yeah.
and strange things happened, and piercing that veil of secrecy was difficult, and now it isn't.
Yeah, now it's out there. And so you've been writing, just to return to Tristan's actual question here. You've been writing the blog, and you've been writing, and there's actually sort of a whole, guess when I think about the Alexandrian, it's sort of a cornerstone actually of modern RPG theory. I hear people quoting it at each other. They'll talk about the three clue rule. They'll talk about prep situations, not plots. And it seems like in the early, like when I was reading that blog in middle school and high school, the kind of early blogosphere of TTRPG stuff, there was actually a lot of blogs like that. But none of them really made it. Except maybe Mike Shea at Sly Flourish. Um, what do you think is different about the Alexandrian that it's still around
That
these
it
years later and
that
those are
it
not?
perseveres. I mean, I guess the easy answer is that I'm stubborn.
It
But
just kept going.
Yeah, I just
Yeah.
kept going. I mean, part of it is that when I originally created the Alexandrian, which actually happened almost exactly 20 years ago, back in July of 2005, the Alexandrian was actually originally created as sort of a place to archive older work that I'd published with various magazines and websites that had been taken offline, or if in case the magazine is not available anymore. Like, so I was like, oh, old columns, I can store them here and people can access them. Because people would actually email me and be like, "Hey, I can't find this thing that you wrote that was on this website that disappeared 3 years ago." I'm like, I should get this stuff available for people again. And so there's always been in my mind with the Alexandrian this idea that it is a place for me to archive my work. And so maybe there was a slight, because like in the early blogosphere, if you will, there was a lot of like, oh, it's my daily diary, and I'll just kind of like share whatever thoughts I happen to have. And my mindset with the Alexandrian was always to kind of have it be a repository for work that was intended to have more of a permanency to it. And so, as a result, I think a lot of the content on the Alexandrian is things like the three clue rule or no base scenario design or the scenario structure challenge. These are things I wrote with the intention of, in some cases, opening a dialogue with my community and being able to share ideas and bounce them around. But in many cases, it was, no, I have these thoughts that I want to crystallize and put somewhere so that I can reference them in the future. And hopefully other people will also find them useful. And so that may have been a difference, but I think it probably just does come back to me being stubborn and sticking with it.
just
Although I'll say
you
the other
you
thing
just
too,
kept posting.
yeah,
Yeah,
just kept posting. But the other thing too is one of the reasons I do keep posting is because of the community. Is
right.
because of people who, like you, have been reading the site forever and ever, or just for a few months, and are reaching out and asking me questions and appreciating the work and telling me about all the awesome, amazing games that they've run as a result of maybe one of my remixes of Dragon Heist or Avernus or Eternal Lies, or how the three clue rule transformed their campaign. I mean, I mean, it's easy to be like, "Oh, well, he just enjoys having his head swollen," and this interview is doing a great job of that, but it's more about, I just love being able to help people, and hearing that and seeing those things and being in a communication with that community. It motivates me to keep doing the work that I do in the hope that we can all become better game masters and have better games together as a community.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think that kind of that dovetails with my theory, my pet theory, which I will now share with you about the longevity. And actually, I would put Mike Shea in this bucket too. Um, It's the same reason that I think that you're saying that D&D took off the way it did. It's just very usable, right? Like, you read the thing, and the remix is actually a really good example of that. Because you can kind of just read that thing and it can hit the table. You need to stay only a little bit ahead of it. But I'm thinking about something like the three clue rule, which is this sort of I mean, how long is the thing? It's a couple hundred words, but you can read it and have your mind changed about how to do something basically in an afternoon and just start doing it. And I think the time it takes to read it and then apply it is very, very short. I think it's very, very readable as opposed to something like maybe a daily diary type log, or even something that's very system specific. Like people were, they were doing monsters for a long time, right? They have a blog post that's a monster a day or something, and those aren't perennial in the same way as something like the three clue
They
rule
date out.
is.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, I think it comes back to, like, I talked about So You Want to Be a Game Master being a book I wrote for me at 10 years old trying to figure things out. But that really has shaped a lot of my approach as a game master, as a game designer, as the author of the Alexandrian, as a sharer of GM advice, that it really is for me about, it's not secret knowledge. It's not some sort of illuminated moment. There is a process to this. There is a procedure to this. Like the three clue rule says, it's not about just going in and having these vibes about what a mystery is. It's like, no, here's how you do it. You need to have a list of revelations. You need to have three clues supporting each revelation, and then your scenario will work. This is how you do it. Like, right. So it's very actionable. And
yeah.
I actually just had a Polish edition of So You Want to Be a Game Master was released last month. And I was at PeerCon, which is a convention in Poznan, in Poland, for the release of it. And I was chatting with the publisher of the Polish edition. And they said, one of the challenges we had with your book was that it's very information dense. There's just so much information packed into it. And I thought that's something I hadn't really thought about in those terms before, but I think it kind of addresses the thing you talk about. Like the three clue rule essay is patting myself on the back furiously, but it's a tight essay. It's short. It's not it's not 30,000 words that needs to have an executive summary boiling down the three core points. I try to do that, boil down, and keep focused on delivering the information in a usable format and also a tight format. And so I think that all kind of plays into that sort of like usability, playability aspect of what you see on the Alexandrian.
Thank you for defining the three clue rule, by the way. I forgot to do that. And I imagine most people, who are listening to this because they're on the forum will have heard about it, but just in case. So just thinking about the three clue rule for myself, why is it you think that investigations, mysteries are so hard for especially newer GMs to run? Is it something like inherent to the setup, the structure, or is it something that they're doing wrong, you think?
Well, I mean, again, patting myself furiously on the back, I think there is a degree to which it's a lot easier to run a mystery now than it was 20 years ago, because I think the three clue rule has actually made a difference, both in people who read
Yeah.
that directly, but also like a lot of game designers have talked to me about the fact, and many have even asked permission to include elements of the three clue rule in their mystery rule book so they can help GMs running their games figure it out. But the reason why you can run into difficulty with mysteries, I think, actually boils down to there's a couple things. First of all, there's the broader problem that for the most part, this hobby still doesn't really think about our scenario structures. We don't actually think about what do we prep? Why do we prep it? How do we use that prep? And so there's a lot of like, oh, I'll just like prep a plot or I'll like jot down some ideas and hopefully it'll work out at the table. And it gets back to that sort of ineffability of like, I hope I understand how to do this and have some inner sense of how to do it. And that's really difficult. And that can really fall apart really easily, regardless of what type of scenario you're talking about. But I think particularly in the case of mysteries, there's another layer to that, which is that when we think about mystery stories, it's very easy to think about mystery stories as being about withholding information. Because, like, if you think about a mystery story, it's about, oh, the detective doesn't know the solution to the mystery. And so when you're running that as a game master, it can be very easy to fall into the trap of, both in terms of design and running it at the table, to fall into the trap of, oh, I need to hide this information from the
Right.
players. And the trick is that what a mystery story is actually about from a structural standpoint is actually not the hiding information or the withholding of information. It is the acquisition of information. So if you as a GM instinctively go, ooh, I can't tell the players that, they'll figure out the mystery. which is a really easy thing to do because oh my goodness, if they figure out the mystery now, it'll all fall apart on me. If you're doing that, then you're fighting them actually being able to complete your mystery. But it's real easy for new GMs to fall into that habit, particularly again if they're actually prepping plots instead of scenarios. If they're prepping A happens, then B happens, then C happens, it's actually really difficult to design a successful mystery under those situations because it's really easy for you to be like, well, I can't tell the players about C yet, and so you're hiding this information from the players in the hope that they'll have the revelations in the correct order or the right sequence or in the right way or whatever the case may be. And of course, the way that a mystery scenario fails is that the players, don't reach the right conclusions, and so all of those things, all those sort of impulses and foibles all contribute to a mystery being really easy to fall apart. The other analogy I draw for this is like if you were designing a dungeon and instead of the dungeon being like, oh, there's a room and there's 2 or 3 exits from it, pick an exit. If every single room in the dungeon was, ooh, there's a room and every exit is a secret door and you have to look for it and find it and choose to go through it, then dungeons would look a lot more like mysteries and we'd have a lot more conversations about, hey, why don't dungeons work? And the answer would
Huh?
be, well, stop making all the doors secret doors, right? Like you need to actually make sure that there are connections. And admittedly, like in a mystery, part of the challenge is that, yeah, it's about acquiring information, but you don't necessarily want a bloody handprint on the wall saying I did it, Stan, So there is that tension within the mystery where you do want the doors to be secret. You just need to have a structure, the 3 clue rule being my solution for that. You do need a structure there that makes it so people can reliably still navigate the adventure.
Right, they need the information eventually. They have to have it in order to proceed. Yeah, that makes sense. I like the dungeon analogy too. It kind of it interacts in an interesting way, which is the other thing when I think of the Alexandrian, I think of 3 things basically. And the second one is the nonlinear dungeon design. It's the Xandering the dungeon. How do I make this thing? How do I cut it up? How do I make it nonlinear? So if we could get into a practical question actually, because the lab, the GML forum is mostly people have been doing this a while. They've read a lot or have learned a lot, at least of the kind of basics of game mastering, and they're very interested in tactics, right? Practical stuff. So let's say you have a new adventure, you're running a D&D module, whatever edition, take your pick, and you haven't read it yet, but you know that you want to run it for your table and you want to Xander the dungeon. In a very like practical sense, what do you do as you approach that?
Well, let's talk a little bit what Xandering is, right? So when we're talking about Xandering, about I don't know, 15 years ago or so, I wrote an article looking at the dungeon design work of people like Janelle Jaquays, who did Caverns of Thracia and The Dark Tower, also dungeon work by Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax, Tom Wham, Frank Menser's work in early dungeon design as well. I was looking at these early dungeons and saying, there's something different about these and the dungeons that at the time I was looking at in D&D 4th edition. And what quickly became apparent is that the difference was linearity. So if you looked at a lot of D&D 4th edition era dungeons, what you had were dungeons that maybe if you looked at the map, like they curled all around the map. But if you went into most rooms had one exit and you just went from room to room until you got to the end of the dungeon. And occasionally maybe they'd be like, oh, there's a second exit that goes to like a side room and then you come back and continue along the main line of the dungeon. And if you look at older school dungeons and even dungeons today, because I think a lot of people have now re-internalized these old school lessons about how dungeons work. If you look at those older dungeons, it's much more of a sort of open node network kind of connectivity that also mirrors the way that the real world works as well. Like people are sometimes like, well, Xandering is this sort of artificial concept. Like, no, it's just the way the world works. Like if you think about the house that you live in, for example, then you have like a front door and a back door and also windows that you can climb through. And oftentimes houses will have like little loops in the floor plan where you can go from, one room to the next in a loop. And so at any scale in the real world, you generally just don't build buildings where you go in one door and then go room by room through the house. Sometimes,
Yeah.
sure, but
Fire
not usually,
hazard.
right? Um,
Yeah.
so it's a more naturalistic way of looking at things, but also there's important sort of gameplay elements to that process. So I needed to come up with a term which has since morphed into Xandering, where I wanted like a verb. And that's it's actually the way you use it. It's like, how do you take a dungeon that's maybe linear and how do you Xander it up? How do you Xander the dungeon? So from a practical standpoint, at that point, looking at say a published dungeon, in this case, and looking at a published dungeon that maybe is or is not Xandering, the first thing I do is kind of diagnose. So I'm looking at a published dungeon map. I take a look at it, and what I do is we talked about those little like side chambers where you go one room off and there's just one room there, and then you're right back on wherever you were before. What I do is I kind of map that out, chart that out, and eliminate all those like little side things that don't go anywhere. And so I'm looking at sort of like, well, where are the main navigation choices? How are rooms connected into loops in various locations and the like? And in many cases, like in newer stuff I've seen, that old school sensibility has already come back into it. So it's a little easier now than it was like 15 years ago when I was writing that essay. But if you do see that kind of linearity, then I look for opportunities to break up that linearity by connecting things together. I might look at one of those little side passages and say, well, is there a way for this side passage to actually have another hallway that loops around and connects back to the rest of the dungeon? And I guess the sort of three layers, I look at individual dungeon levels and make sure that those individual levels are, generally speaking, interconnected with each other in interesting ways. The second thing is, if the dungeon has multiple levels, then I will almost always want to have more than one way to um, to leave a dungeon level and go to another dungeon level, multiple entrances and multiple exits. And so to some extent, you can think about that at sort of a fractal level, where you look at individual rooms or clusters of rooms and you want to have multiple ways out of those, multiple access points. And then you look at a whole level, you can think the whole level is just basically like one big dungeon room. And are there multiple ways of connecting from that dungeon room to others? And of course, the question always comes back to, you always want to keep in mind, why are we doing this? And that just boils down to, first, it's nice for players to have choice because it makes them feel like they're actually exploring a space, because they actually are exploring a space. But it also leads to a more robust playing experience at the table. If you design a dungeon, which is this linear experience where you start at the entrance and you go basically room by room all the way from the beginning to the end, if you run into an area of that dungeon where, for example, you as the dungeon master have designed an encounter that's too tough, and so the players hit that and they're like, I don't know how to get past this. We can't beat the ogre for whatever reason. Well, if you design this linear dungeon, the only thing the players can do is maybe back off and then come back and hit their heads against the ogre again and again until maybe they get lucky or something changes or you nerf the ogre or whatever the case may be. And there's moments where that can be fine, but generally speaking, if you give them other paths, then maybe they can just find a way to go around the ogre. And maybe that means dealing with, the cloakers in the shadow canyons instead, but they can find a way around that ogre. So they have multiple options then, which then begins unlocking a layer of play that I refer to as strategic play. So there's tactical play, which is what happens inside interior encounters, where you're fighting the cloakers in the shadow canyons, and there's all kinds of tactical decisions you're making about how to fight them. But then there can be, once you've Xandered a dungeon, this wider strategic level of play where you're saying, okay, well, do we need to fight the ogre, or can we go around the ogre? Can we forge an alliance with the goblins over here to come help us with the ogre? And so once you've sort of unlocked this linearity, you begin unlocking also interconnections between the material. And once you have those interconnections and different pathway options, all of that begins adding up to the players being able to make richer and more interesting choices, exploiting those connections and choosing the paths that they take, and being rewarded for their exploration in myriad ways, on a strategic and emotional level.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like the other the other thing you talk about, actually, and I get the sense this is all kind of connected, right? This is all the style of running games that you've been developing for, since 1989, or maybe a little bit after that. But the other thing comes to mind is prepping a situation and not a plot. It sounds like you're describing the dungeon not as a puzzle to be solved, or I guess an experience to be had, but as a situation to be interacted with. You have the goblins, you have the ogre, you have the cloakers. And my sense just from reading the blog is like you just set those things up and then you take a step back and you just kind of see like what's going on, what's going to happen here, right? Is that what that phrase means to you? Prep situations, not plots?
That's 100% it. Yeah. So there's an essay I wrote called "Don't Prep Plots," and the tagline, like you say, is don't prep plots, prep situations. And so plot can mean a lot of different things in English. For this purpose, I kind of defined it as when you're prepping a plot, what you're doing is prepping a specific sequence of actions. A happens, and then B happens, and then C happens. And since writing that essay, I've kind of refined the idea a bit that what we're actually talking about frequently when we talk about prepping plots is that what you actually end up prepping is the idea that, oh, well, the players will do A, and then the players will do B, and then the players will do C. And there's a couple of reasons why I don't think that's a good idea. And the first is that it doesn't actually work all that well. And the reason it doesn't work all that well is that when you say, oh, well, the players are going to do A, then they're going to do B, then they're going to do C, you are now in a position where you need to kind of just cross your fingers and hope that the players will make those specific choices in that specific order. Or you need to do a lot of effort to try to force them to do those things, either by openly railroading them, which of course is frustrating to players, or by like secretly structuring the adventure in such a way that there's no other way that they can do it, which then immediately runs into any kind of number of difficulties because players are creative and also oftentimes are playing super heroic type characters or fantastical beings with amazing powers who oftentimes those powers make it increasingly difficult to like force them to do A and then B and then C, which is, this is a bit of a tangent, but one of the reasons people struggle with high level D&D campaigns is because they are prepping the players need to do A, they need to do B, and they need to do C. And it's relatively easy to force first level players to do that. Once you start giving characters abilities like teleportation or even invisibility, things like that that begin unlocking different ways of interacting with an
Right. They
environment.
have too many cool tools and they want to use them, right? And they should. They
Right, and so
should use
you
them.
either get in a situation like, "Oh, I gotta stop them from doing all these cool things they can do," so they're forced to do this. So that's one reason to not do it, is that it's a lot more difficult to try to force the players to do that. It's what I refer to as fragility in a scenario. There's robust scenarios that will likely hold up in play, and then there's fragile scenarios that will frequently break in play because they are fragile specifically because they are heavily reliant on a specific choice being made or a specific outcome. And that could be both in terms of choice. It can also be going back to our mysteries. Like if you only have one clue that the players must find, they must interpret correctly, and then they have to take action based on that clue, and you only have the one clue, there's all kinds of ways that can break down. Like you
Yeah.
might make a skill check for them to find it. They might just fail that skill check. And that fragility, that dependence on this one linkage not breaking immediately falls apart and your adventure is broken. And now you're trying to solve that at the table. Coming all the way back to don't prep plots, prep situations. Instead of prepping, the players do A, they do B, they do C. Instead, what you're doing is you are prepping. I like to think of them as like a toy box or a toolbox full of different things that you as the game master can bring to the table and then be able to actively play with the players. The players say they want to do this, and you're like, oh, I've got the perfect toy. I'm going to take that out and play with them using this toy. And then when you have that toy do something, the players respond by having their characters do something, and now you can respond, and now you're actively playing with each other. And we talk about other phrases like playing to find out, for example. This is very much what playing to find out is all about. It's about being at the table and actively interacting with the players and using the toys that you have, all the tools that you have, to actively engage the players in that moment of play at the table. And the interesting thing is that this can sound really intimidating because you're like, well, I don't know what's going to happen. But the truth is, and I've talked to so many new GMs, people who haven't GM'd all that much, and they've been struggling and struggling prepping these railroads because they've been told that railroading their players is easier because you know what's going to happen. And what they discover over and over again is that railroaded adventures, and even in many cases, linear adventures where you're trying to force this decision-making process on the players. There are other linear adventure structures that work just fine. We can talk about those. But linear adventure structures where you're kind of trying to force the players to take these specific actions, those are so fragile. And particularly for new GMs, they're so fragile that if you're an experienced GM, a link breaks and you have enough experience that maybe you can figure out how to like reroute or make the link work again, or you're just better at forcing the players to do the things you want them to do. But as a new GM, it's so difficult when something breaks in play to try and fix it on the fly. And the truth, I've encountered this over and over again talking to GMs, when they shift that mindset, when they shift from, I'm going to try and force the players to do these things, And they may not even think of it that way. They're probably thinking in terms of like, oh, well, this is what the adventure's about. A happens, then B happens, then C happens. But when they flip away from that and think, okay, well, this is the situation that the players find themselves in. I can't wait to find out what the players are going to do so I can respond to it with the tools that I've created for myself in this situation. When that flip is switched, things become so much easier.
Yeah.
It's so much easier to just be available in the moment and have, D. Vincent Baker talks about being in a conversation with your players. Can you imagine a conversation like not gaming conversation, just any conversation where you're like, okay, I'm going to have this conversation with somebody and they're going to say A and then they're going to say B and then they're going to say C. And you're like, well, how are you going to force the other person in a conversation to say the things you want them to say? It's so much easier to maybe have a list of talking points or things you want to chat about, but to just come to that conversation and actually just have a moment with that person and actually talk to them and listen to what they're saying and share what you want to say. And that's what that analogy is about, is that the analogy of the conversation or the paradigm of the conversation at the table. That's what that's about, is about being in the moment and actually talking to each other, actually sharing ideas, actually, like I say, I call it active play, being in that moment of active play and actively playing with each other.
Yeah, it's the refinement of so many of those ideas, I think. Not that just that phrase about the situations and the plots, but the conversation as a metaphor as well. We can distill it even farther. We can convince people to flip that switch and kind of turn the game around. It won't surprise you to hear probably that that is one of the big influences that we took into the proactive role playing book, and then also in the next book, which is about like emergent campaigns, right? Playing to find out what happens, being a player at the table, like that is the strength of a tabletop game. Like you can't do that anywhere else.
Right.
Nobody knows what's going to happen. Nobody's driving this thing.
Hmm.
You're all just kind of in there figuring out where it's going to go together, and that's so thrilling. It's like the best part of the game. Why would you try to wrangle that out of your game?
100%.
Um,
Well, and
yeah,
it's the thing that makes role playing games unique, right? And if you're going to come to a
yeah.
medium,
Nothing
you
else does
should,
it.
yeah, if you're going to come to a medium, you should try and do what that medium is really good at. And when you fight against that and try and turn D&D into a board game or something, there's nothing necessarily wrong with a board game experience. I love Gloomhaven. I enjoy Descent. I enjoy those
Yes.
kinds of dungeon crawler board games, but I prefer Gloomhaven to trying to play a role playing game that's being forced into a box. It's just it's
Yeah, just play Gloomhaven instead,
like,
right? If
yeah,
that's what you want to play, great,
well,
no shame.
yeah, no,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely not. Like, and I've played Gloomhaven almost 100 times now, so you
Wow,
know,
nice.
so I enjoy those games. Sometimes I have these conversations, like, well, you just hate other types of games. I'm like, that's not what this conversation is about at all. This is about
Yeah.
trying to like, this is about looking at all the different tools you have available to you.
Yeah. Well, look, I don't want to keep you too long. I just have a couple more little questions for you that I hope some people get some use out of, some insight out of.
I'm happy to stay here as long as you want to chat. So.
Oh, great. Okay, because then here's a longer question for you. It's about recommendations, right? So you were talking about Gloomhaven. 100 plays is wild, by the way, for people who don't know. I mean, Gloomhaven's, I guess, been out for years now, but one play is like a 3-4 hour thing. I think I must be up to 50, and I feel like I actually haven't even finished the campaign,
No,
which
it's
is,
it's a crazy game. The end of the box had
yeah,
like 120 scenarios in it.
yeah.
I started
I
my Gloomhaven run in late 2018 or early 2019.
Right when
So
it came
we
out,
we
yeah.
played quite a bit, and then COVID happened. We took a year and a half off, and then came back together and have played a bunch more since then. We finished the main campaign and are doing like the first expansion pack. Um, I also ambitiously bought. I know this is a huge tangent from,
That's good. I just picked up
but
Jonathan the Lion. I've been thinking about Gloomhaven today, so,
Jaws of the
yeah.
Lion is fantastic. I actually played all of Jaws of the Lion with a different group.
Are you counting that in your 100
I
plays?
wasn't actually, so I've actually played
Okay,
probably
so
a
we're
bit
at, like,
more actually.
150? Yeah, nice.
Yeah, I also have, Frosthaven sitting on my shelf, which I had kickstarted
Uh-huh.
just before the pandemic, thinking, "Oh, we're gonna wrap up Gloomhaven soon," because we're
I need
playing it so
something
much,
to
we must
play.
be wrapping it up soon, and then 5 years later, I'm still playing
Uh,
Gloomhaven, and Frosthaven, stares at me from the shelf accusingly. I'm like, "I will get to you, I promise it will happen
someday. Yeah,
someday."
give it time. No need to rush it. Well, so with that in mind, a lot of the people on the lab are new RPG junkies, right? They wanna play new systems, they wanna try new things. So we like to ask guests about their favorites and their recommendations. I found, speaking of your blog as an archive, I found an article you wrote in 2000. about Unknown Armies,
Yes,
which is a
yes.
very cool and weird game that's very 90s coded, in a lot of ways. And 20 years later, I think you're producing that game, right? Or you were recently?
I was when I was the
Uh,
RPG producer at Atlas.
yeah.
I worked on the 3rd edition of the game, and just helped develop an adventure with Greg Stolze, one of the original creators.
Yeah.
Did a game called did an adventure called Bring Me the Head of the Count of Saint Germain, which was a really
Right.
cool
Yes.
project to work on.
Yes. So Unknown Armies is great at that kind. It has a very specific aesthetic, and there's a couple games like that that you've worked on. The question is, are there any games with a very specific aesthetic that you can't really use another game for, that you think people should check out if they want to play something cool?
Well, that's a great question. I think like in terms of like cool aesthetics, you can't do anything else with, or you can't do with anything else easily. Atlas Games actually has done a whole bunch of these. There's Unknown Armies, which was developed by Greg Stolze and John Tynes, and that's really amazing game that I oftentimes heavy influence there. I think is Tim Powers novels, and the sort of like this urban eye line on like fantasy, but with a very gritty, almost surrealistic edge to it. It's really difficult for me to actually
Yeah.
describe what this
It's
game
hard.
feels
Yeah.
like, but it's such a unique feel. And I think I was actually really impressed. I enjoyed playing on, like you say, you read an article I published way back in 2000. It was really published in Pyramid Magazine with Steve Jackson Games because I loved it back then so much. Uh, I was really impressed with the work that Greg Stolze did on the 3rd edition of the game that came out just a few years ago. Although I guess I say that, but it was pre-COVID, so it was a lifetime ago as well.
Yep. A different
But
world.
recently came out, did a really great job of kind of taking a game that did amazing things in the 90s and boiling it down into taking advantage of a lot of sort of modern game design ideas and boiling it down to something equally unique today. I love that game. That's an amazing game, and it's one of those games I wish I could play even more of. Um, there are a lot of games that do a great job of having good mechanical structural support these days that create unique experiences at the table that you can't get unless you port those mechanical structures someplace else. So like I think most people these days know about John Harper's Blades in the Dark, for example, but that's a great
Yeah.
example of a game where you can kind of like do some of those things in other games, but unless you port over sort of the core structures that Harper really perfected in terms of how you build a crew and how the downtime works in building up both your crew and also the next job that you're going on, and all that connects back to the mechanics of how your characters work and how your characters recover by pursuing their vices, which are linked into. It's just such an amazing sort of interconnected experience. That's a great example of that. A little bit more old school. So like recent Blades in the Dark, recent-ish, 90-ish Unknown Armies. Going even further back, Greg Stafford's Pendragon game, which is about playing Arthurian knights, and is specifically designed to be played over decades of game time. Has a very unique feel as a result because it has these specific structures for not only running like your character but your character's heirs as the campaign goes down through the years. That's I've never actually had a chance to play Pendragon, but that game is prominent on my bucket list of things to check out and play. Other games along these same lines, Kenneth Height's Night's Black Agents has this really cool set of structures, both around what you as agents can do that then link into GM side structures called a conspiramid and a vampyramid. That so Night's Black Agents is a game where everybody plays Secret Service agents who have retired and then discovered that vampires exist, and so now they use their particular set of skills they've learned as intelligence agents to fight the vampire conspiracy. And so the GM has this conspiramid that breaks down how the vampire conspiracy works, and then a vampyramid that is used in concert with the conspiramid to have the vampires actively respond to the players and come and do blowback and push back on them in response to the missions that the PCs are taking. But then the whole thing is interacting also with mechanics the players have for being very proactive and sort of creating their own methods of investigating and pursuing the conspiracy, while the conspiramid gives the GM a structure for being able to actively play and actively respond to that. So a really great game that creates a very unique feel at the table. Um, and that one may be a little bit more easier to port some of those conspiramid and band pyramid ideas to other systems because I've done that. But definitely one of those things where like if you just this is one of the things too is like I think more people like with games like these, more people need to also be open to like let's go and just at least for a little while play the game exactly as written and see what spills out. And a lot of people just kind of like, well, sometimes when they're running an RPG, they just kind of default back to, oh, well, I'll just call for skill checks for everything. And then that's kind of the only structure there'll be. And I think people are robbing themselves of some pretty unique experiences and some pretty robust support structures that some of these games can really offer when they kind of turn every RPG into the same game. Kind of
Yeah,
feel.
everything is D&D.
Everything is D&D. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to avoid, you know, it's such a monolith. But yeah, those are great recs. We'll put them in the show notes. What is it that you're running right now? That's not on my list. I'm just curious.
No, so I'm currently running a long-running D&D 3rd edition campaign, actually set in Monty Cook's Tollus. I've been running that campaign since 2007. Um, and so that campaign has slowed down a bit. All the players in that campaign back in 2016 had kids within about 6 months of each other, and since then we haven't played nearly as much as we used to. But
That's tough, yeah.
we still play several times a
But you
year,
still that's aspirational, man.
and
Yeah.
and we keep moving that forward. Yeah, so that's we all started in a very different place back in 2007. We're in a very different place now, but we still love that
Yeah.
campaign. So that one's ongoing. I'm also currently running a Knights Black Agents campaign. We were just talking about that, but I'm running
Yeah.
a remix of a adventure campaign called the Zologeny Quartet by Kenneth Hite and Gareth Hanrahan. And
Ooh,
I'm having a ton of fun
friend
with
of the
that
pod,
system. Yeah,
actually. Yeah.
really great stuff. I think you were mentioning you were running 13th Age. Gareth has done all kinds of cool stuff for
Oh,
13th
yeah.
Age.
I'm a big Gareth fanboy, actually.
He's pretty cool. I've got a
Yeah.
bunch of his stuff on my bucket list. Tears of the Stone Thief and Pirates of
Best ever, in
Draenach.
my opinion. Yeah, best
Amazing stuff.
module ever written.
Yeah. Pirates of Draenach is a great traveler
Uh-huh.
campaign he did as well. Fantastic stuff. So Gareth's fantastic. I love his work. So those I'm running those two. I'm also running Mothership, Sean McCoy's Mothership.
Cool.
This actually I've been on hiatus for a few months here. I'm actually right at this particular instant. I'm under a lot of deadline pressure because I'm trying to get my next book finished. It's called So You Want to Be a Dragon Slayer. So I'm trying to wrap that up, and so a couple of my K
Oh,
games have been on
okay.
hold for the summer. But Mothership, I've been doing it as an open table where basically I say, hey, we're going to play Mothership on Tuesday or Thursday night. Anybody who wants to show up, you can show up and probably get murdered by an alien. So Mothership.
That swept at the Ennies this year too. That was the other big winner,
Yeah,
I would
fantastic.
say.
And it has such a
Yeah.
great adventure ecosystem, which is what really attracts me to it. Like they do these wonderful little trifold modules that are like basically one sheet on both sides. You fold them up. I don't have one here.
I have
Um,
one downstairs.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I'll
they're
put a
they're in the
picture
next
in the
room
show
currently.
notes.
But they're fantastic. You can just pick those up, read them in about 10 to 15 minutes, and there's so many good ones that I just have a stack of them, and so people can just come over and I can pick that up and run it super fast. Character creation super fast. The adventures are ready to go. It's just a really nice, light way of being able to play and run some role playing games. So fantastic stuff.
Yeah, that's great. Last question for me then is just you are now you are a content creator. I don't know how you feel about that label, you know, but you've been a content creator for a long time, but now it's sort of capital C content
Right.
creator, YouTube, etc. Are there any other small creators as in not other than you, but are there any small creators that you're aware of that you think should get more attention that people should check out?
Well, that's a great question. I was thinking this more in terms of like small game designers. And I had
Even
like a
better.
whole thing there. In terms of game designers, there's a guy named Nick Bate who has designed some really cool storytelling games. One's called Stealing the Throne, which is all about putting together a crew to go steal a giant mecha uh, from the Empire. He also has a game coming out really shortly, I believe, by Kickstarter called Against Time and Death, which is specifically designed for two players um, who are playing together, each playing a different faction who is using time travel to try to reshape the world to their agenda.
Awesome.
Fantastically creative stuff. Avery Alder's The Quiet Year is a particular favorite of mine. I'm not sure that it's always interesting to know like what qualifies as small, lesser known. Like, 'cause, like
Yeah.
There's people listening to this now who are like, I don't know who John Harper is. I'm like, how do you not know who John Harper is?
Yeah, yeah. Have you not heard of The Quiet Year? Yeah.
Right. But The Quiet by Avery Alder is a fantastic game. For those not familiar with it, it's a map-based storytelling game where you have a map of a post-apocalyptic settlement, and you, through the mechanics of the game and card draws that provide creative prompts, you actually develop the world and the community through drawing on the map, and you develop the world through drawing the map. Really cool game. A lot of people use it to like play that game to develop a community and a setting, and then they will transfer that into an RPG of choice, right?
Yeah, that's what we've done. It's hard
Um,
sometimes though, because you think of crazy stuff in the map building, and then it's really hard to find a game
then it's tough to
to
like,
suit
yeah,
that.
make it
Yeah.
work. Emmy Cave Girl Allen is another person I like to recommend. She came up with a concept called the depth crawl, and she's got a couple different really great adventures along these gardens of Yin, which is YNN, and also uh, the oh no, I'm going to blank on the name now. It's not the is it the Black Library or is it the Eben Library? It is a library. Try and find it. It's
Yeah.
really
Well.
that adventure is really cool. I have a link down there that solves
Yeah.
my I can't remember which synonym of black. I think it's black. Now I'm guessing even that. But this is a really cool adventure where the idea is that there are these portals into this sort of library that exists between our spaces, kind of like a back rooms kind of interstitial space kind of thing, liminal space kind of thing. And it's just this really cool adventure where you kind of maybe you end up wandering in there by accident, but then there are strange librarians who are hoarding and harvesting knowledge. It's a really cool adventure. But Gardens of Yin does kind of uses a similar structure in this depth crawl structure to explore sort of a fairy realm that is ever shifting and morphing. And so those are really cool, unique experiences.
Yeah. We'll find the creator you're talking about. Those are great recs. I appreciate it. I'm always looking for new stuff to add to my list of books. I'm definitely gonna read at some point. Well, so last couple questions then. What's next for you? You got the second book coming out. When is that releasing?
That should be out next year at this point.
Great.
I'm currently trying to wrap up the writing on it. Because it's called So You Want to Be a Dragon Slayer. So You Want to Be a Game Master was all about how do you as a game master take your first steps and then the next 50 steps past that, and looked at different scenario structures like dungeons and raids and heists and mysteries and urban crawls and wilderness exploration, and looked at, okay, well, again, what do you prep? Why do you prep it? And how to use it at the table? So You Want to Be a Dragon Slayer is all about the player side of the experience and becoming a really great player. And it's really about, as a player, taking the next step or kind of leveling up your role playing to the next level, but also has what I think is kind of a unique slant because it also tries to do the same thing in terms of like, these are the steps. And it does that through both character creation and role playing at the table. These are things you can do, practical advice for, take these steps and then begin exploring those steps. But also, the other thing I realized is that uh, a lot of player advice tends to be very general. And one of the reasons for that is because there's no way to know what the GM is going to be doing per se. But one of the things about having written So You Want to Be a Game Master is that I have a very clear vision of like what a dungeon is
Yeah.
and what a mystery is and so forth. And so there's actually chapters in So You Want to Be a Dragon Slayer that are like, okay, you're going on a dungeon crawl. How do you survive? You're going to solve a mystery. What does it actually mean to solve a mystery? How do you look for clues? How do you keep track of the clues you have? How do you use those clues to draw conclusions that you can then take action on? And so it gets down to a very sort of practical level of advice for all these different kinds of adventures. And then I have this idea that isn't essential, but the idea is that you can actually do an adventure book club where the GM has So You Want to Be a Game Master and the players have So You Want to Be a Dragon Slayer. And each week you can be like, okay, we're going to do a dungeon adventure this week. The DM can go read his chapter on how to design a great dungeon. The players can read their chapter on how to be great dungeon explorers. And then you guys can play the adventure together and then have like a little book club meeting talking about things that worked well and how do we want to explore those concepts going forward. So I'm really excited
That's
about.
almost like that's cheating, That's that's great. Right. Yeah, writing a response to your own book. That's gonna crush. That's
I'm
gonna be
I'm
awesome. I've
I'm
heard a
real
lot of
hopeful
people
people love
say
it.
that they wish that existed, that
Yeah.
kind
So
of thing.
I'm really hopeful that the book in my head will get onto the page and that people will enjoy it as much as I have this vision, and I think it's going to be really good that it's not just the GM being responsible for this stuff. It can be a whole table experience, and people can kind of level up together and have really fantastic tables. One of the things I talk about in the book is like, talking about like Matthew Mercer on Critical Role or Brennan Lee Mulligan at Dimension 20, and or Brennan Lee Mulligan at Critical Role coming up, I guess.
Yeah, apparently.
But, we talk about those. Those are obviously Matt and Brandon are fantastic GMs, but one of their secret superpowers is the fact that their players are so good.
Yeah, also kind of cheating.
Yeah, and so, like, having great players is such a great way to be a great GM, and so that's really what the new book is about how can you be the type of player that helps make a GM great and create that experience for yourself at the table as a player, and be part of the solution and not just hope you'll find it someday, but to actually pursue it.
That's beautiful. The best table that you could possibly sit at.
The best
Yeah.
table. I love that, yeah.
Well, where can people find you if they're I mean, we talked about it though. It's on my list. I got to ask you, where can people find you if they want to read more of your work for the second or third or fourth time?
Well, I am all over the place. We've talked about my book, So You Want to Be a Game Master. That's a great introduction to my GMing philosophy. But obviously, I'm online at the Alexandrian, which is thealexandrian.net. You can find links to everything else I do, which include a YouTube channel, includes weekly Twitch streaming. So on Twitch, I'm showing up doing a stream called Random GM Tips, where it's basically just an AMA where people can come and join and ask me questions about GMing or game design or adventure design. And we kind of chat things through. Really, it's a really cool stream, if I do say so myself. I just really enjoy people coming in. The questions they ask take me to places I never thought about in terms of thinking about game design. And so I really enjoy that. I also have a Discord, which has a ton of really amazing game masters on there who are constantly swapping tips and advice and resources. I'm there too, but it's just a really fantastic community. So I'm everywhere at this point, it feels like, but you can find me at thealexandrian.net and there'll be links to everything else I do there.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll put a link to the YouTube and the Patreon and everything. Well, great. Thank you so much for your time today. It's such a fantastic blessing to meet you and talk to you. Um, I have more questions for you, and then so I hope we can get together another time and do
I,
another one.
I was just about to say, I would love to do this again, and hopefully Tristan will be able to join us next
I
time.
know, I sure hope so. Yeah, that
I hope he feels better
lazy.
soon.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for joining me today. I appreciate that very much.
Thank you so much, Jonah.